Hi everyone. I was in between projects again and I had a little bit of free time. And given that Israel is already officially breaking the ceasefire in Gaza, I thought it would be a good opportunity to do a video about Islamophobia as it pertains to the Gazan genocide, the Palestinian conflict. And it's the same idea as the last video I did, where in that video I talked about liberals and why they're awful people and their belief system sucks as it pertains to Gaza. Now we'll be talking about Islamophobia, and I wanted to respond to a few videos. The videos that we'll be going over are Hasan Israel breaks ceasefire, how liberal media normalizes genocide by Noah Samson, racism against Muslims is out of control on social media. And I also wanted to mention Legal Eagle in regards, it's kind of a segue between liberals, American liberals, and covering the Gazan genocide, or rather not talking about it. And I thought what we would do is we would start with Legal Eagle and just kind of talk about his channel a little bit, because he's not someone that I mentioned last time around. But given that I appreciate some of the material that he does and some of the stuff, or rather what he doesn't do, or what he says, but he takes a lot of time to talk about certain things but not other things, and if he does mention those other things, he isn't nearly radical enough. So I thought we would start with him, and then what we would do is go over Noah Samson and the Kavernacle, and then I think we probably would conclude with Hasan. I don't know if we're gonna watch the Hasan one all the way through or not. Also, to clarify, I haven't seen the Hasan video or the Kavernacle one, but I have seen the Noah Samson one. But the Noah Samson one is really well done, so I thought I would go over it because I really like the content that Noah does, and even though I have a tiny ass little channel compared to his, I like to talk about the stuff that he does because he does good work. So first and foremost, we have Legal Eagle here, and Legal Eagle is a lawyer. He is someone who is not just a practicing lawyer, but he also teaches law, from what I understand, in this video where he says I'm quitting, and it's kind of a joke, clickbait basically. He mentions that he also teaches law, so he has a practice and he's established as a lawyer, and I think he actually teaches out of the District of Columbia in Washington DC. Could be wrong about that, but from what I understand, he's a fairly entrenched lawyer in terms of where he works, but he's also someone who has, a fairly good sense of humor. He's often gone over popular media in the past, so that vibes with me a bit. He talks about Better Call Saul, and he goes over My Cousin Vinny and a few other films. I will say that he does like Chuck in Better Call Saul, as opposed to Saul Goodman himself, and the fact that he's a criminal lawyer. So that's kind of a red flag. And there are definitely things I could say about Legal Eagle here, or that I'm going to say right now, in terms of Islamophobia and white moderacy and liberalism and stuff like that. And basically the gist is Legal Eagle is a liberal individual. He's a liberal because he's not nearly radical enough. Look at who he represents. He represents people, middle class people who can afford to pay him. So any criticism that you could say level at Chuck from Better Call Saul, chicanery. He's basically, his clients are rich middle class people, relatively speaking. Compared to, say, people in Gaza. You don't have him bringing anyone on to talk about the Gazans and the genocide. He does mention The Onion, for instance, and how The Onion is making fun of Alex Jones. just to mention something where he's talking about like a political channel that's more left leaning. He does mention like the Onion, for instance, but otherwise he's like, oh no, democracy in America's dead, and fascism only just happened now, and the stakes have never been higher, and I need to go out on a limb and tell people to vote. He's acting like, okay, Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, which there is kind of historical precedent for that, but at the same time, he's acting like it's a very Star Wars situation where the Jedi Council is under attack by Sith infiltrators, and democracy is going to die, as if it hasn't been an oligarchy built on genocide within a police state and a settler colony the entire time. So right off the bat, he's off on some pretty shaky footing as a liberal in that respect. So how does that tie into Islamophobia and Gaza? And the simple answer is Islamophobia isn't just overt hatred against a particular group or talking about them in a negative way. It's also not talking about them. And the thing is that Legal Eagle isn't just one person. He represents a brand, and he represents other people, or other people represent him back and forth, that come onto his channel and talk about different things, largely domestically. But he does have a military lawyer, like a tribunal lawyer. And I think he goes, I don't know his actual name, but the Scowl Owl is his handle through Legal Eagle. And that particular lawyer talks about military law in ways that sort of bleeds out into foreign policy. And I don't know if there's a video that I can find real quick where if we scroll down, like there's definitely like collabs and stuff like that. Yeah, here's one. Real lawyers react to primal fear. So this person here on the right of this thumbnail is a lawyer who, from what I understand, specializes in military law. And Legal Eagle is more, from what I understand, copyright law, the material side of things from a commerce standpoint. And by and large, when this person, the military lawyer, talks about stuff like they went over A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, and You Can't Handle the Truth, that movie. And they talk about like foreign policy and human rights violations, but because they're analyzing media that's, American Hollywood films, they're talking about it from like the American perspective. And they're like, oh, they're not critiquing American imperialism. They're not critiquing the CIA. They're not critiquing the American military in terms of its role in American foreign policy. And that's pretty immediate just from watching these collabs between Scowl Owl and Legal Eagle. But also, excluding that, who he chooses to have on in collab with, he's not having any Palestinians on, for instance. He's not having anyone come on who would challenge the profit motive for him, because the moment you do that, your videos get demonetized, you can get blacklisted, that kind of thing. And that's like the difference between someone like Legal Eagle and Noah Samsen, where Noah Samsen is like, he refuses to censor any of his language, and he's all business, baby, and he's all in, and he relies on Patreon to make money. So he has a large platform, but it's largely demonetized, and his goal is to educate in terms of American atrocities. Where Legal Eagle, like in the past 9 months, he has one video about Israel Palestine, and it's the legality of the protests on campus. And as far as I can tell, within the past couple of years, that is the only video that he has on Palestine. Yeah, scrolling through here, he has basically one video in the past. If we go back 2 years, yeah, it's the only video that he has on Israel-Palestine, and it's not even protesting it. Instead, a lot of what he does is he's like, oh no, like there might be a civil war, Mickey Mouse and Disney, Trump, Trump is basically a content mill for him, talking about, popular cases and popular media. But most of his videos are about Trump and the possibility of civil war domestically. And there are some instances he might talk about Alex Jones, and he'll talk about the legality of that. but his videos don't actually venture into critiquing America and Israel and the relationship that they have and the relationship that the law has to that. He doesn't go out on a limb and try and talk about any of that. And to be fair to his channel, he does largely stay within the confines of law as it's practiced, but that wouldn't stop him from talking about international law. You know, he could have the ICJ, at least I think it's the ICJ, where they talk about finding or holding Israel accountable for the genocide and saying that they found that it was plausible that Israel was, you know, committing a genocide, and there are various other nonprofit organizations that have done similar work that involve lawyers, and you think that Legal Eagle could do that, but he doesn't do that, and that's worth noting. That's a very white liberal thing. He's worried we're fucked, Trump is immune, Biden convicted, Hunter Biden sorry. Like, he talks about American executives and American politicians, and he has the ability to talk about Palestine and to have international lawyers that represent the Palestinian cause. They exist. He just doesn't talk about them. He just talks about Trump and how it's going to affect white middle class people and how it is going to affect establishment politics. So that's a very white liberal thing. And that's admittedly a very shitty thing of Legal Eagle to do, or rather not to do, in terms of who he's not having on his channel. You know, there's plenty of interesting law and plenty of important law talking about the rights of the Palestinians, and he doesn't have any videos. You know, he talks about he does talk about the Electoral College and how it sucks, which I think is a good thing, but again, that's a domestic issue. He talks about stealing the White House, as if the White House doesn't just belong to a group of people that doesn't care about us before Trump came along, which is absolutely not true. The American presidency has always served the elite. So there's nothing to steal, except, you know, Trump is basically representing himself and his cronies, but they're still the bourgeoisie. It's just the theft of power through fascism among the bourgeoisie. And it's bad, but also in terms of the whole point that Legal Eagle's missing in terms of all of this is he's like, how is this going to affect white middle class voters? And he, first and foremost, or just middle class voters more broadly, middle class America and token people included, let's just throw that in there. He doesn't see the positive in Trump being elected, which is that American foreign policy is being drastically reduced. And I think there's even some videos where he talks about U.S. aid. If I can find it here, scrolling up, it was one of his newer videos. Yeah, like he talks about Trump, he talks about Musk, he talks about Doge. Yes, shutting down U.S. aid is illegal, but they did it anyways. So he's basically being reactionary towards Trump, affecting the United States' ability to do imperialism through soft power, which is what U.S. aid is all about. So he's acting like that's a bad thing when it's not. So again, he's literally whitewashing American genocide by saying, oh, it's Trump and his Sith Lords that are bad. But Obama and Biden, like, he's not really critiquing them at all. And so he's very much clutching his pearls the way that a white liberal would do, and that's bad. And it's Islamophobic because he's omitting certain things from the narrative. So that's basically Legal Eagle's channel in a nutshell. I do watch it just to understand how American law works, but there are definitely plenty of other channels I could probably recommend. There's a particular channel that talks about Copaganda. Skip Intro is a channel that is dedicated to Copaganda that will talk about it in popular media, but he brings on a lot of people that work in law that are not white liberals. And so he'll have people like FD Signifier on his channel, and a lot of people that don't necessarily have YouTube channels, but again, they work within the system. And so if you watch like his Law and Order videos or just his Copaganda playlists in particular, he's going to be talking about law in terms of criminal law, whereas Legal Eagle is more about the commercial side of things. And when he does lean into politics that concern American foreign policy, he takes the side of the oppressor. So that's Legal Eagle in terms of how he goes about things, whereas someone like Copaganda gets into the law aspect of it. But then we have people like Noah Samson who they don't practice law themselves, though they do talk about the coverage of the law. So what we're going to do next here is we're going to look into Noah Samson and how liberal media normalizes genocide, which is what Legal Eagle is guilty of doing. He normalizes it because he doesn't talk about it. And if he does mention anything at all, it's always in a very safe, sanitized kind of way. And he's always clutching his pearls and saying Donald Trump is bad for imperialism, when even though Donald Trump is largely going to do imperialism in the Middle East, he's going to limit the United States' capacity to do that. And that includes through cutting U.S. aid and various other forms of soft power that have allowed Israel to brutalize Gaza through U.S. influence for as long as they have. And one thing that Noah Samson in particular specializes in here is he talks about lies of omission and whitewashing. So we're going to watch this next, and then we'll also talk about covering racism against Muslims, which again, there's plenty of law surrounding that. So the fact that Legal Eagle doesn't talk about that at all, his constituents are completely different. The Kavernacle is Irish Republican, from what I understand, and they're definitely a communist, an open communist on YouTube, who's pretty left leaning, of a similar left leaning quality to Noah Samson. A bit of a smaller channel, but they cover a lot of different subjects. So we're going to watch these two videos, and then we might end on Hasan if I feel like it. So first up here is Noah Samson's How Liberal Media Normalizes Genocide. And this is a follow-up to the past video that they did where they talked about the situation in Gaza more broadly in relation to the whitewashing of genocide and liberal media. But this is more like a smaller example of that through the Washington Post specifically. So we're going to watch this first, and we'll just do a play-by-play. Also, another thing before we start is just in terms of the way that Noah goes about things, he's not trying to monetize these videos like it's more nonprofit work. He does accept donations to Patreon just so he has some money to work with and to keep the lights on, but he's not grifting when he's doing this. And you can tell because he's literally just sitting down with a microphone and just giving it to you straight. There's no fancy production values in terms of, there's no like bells and whistles. It's like, okay, it's a man sitting in front of a camera and just giving it to you straight from a pear cider made from 100% pear. And in terms of that, he does edit his videos, and he has a lot of good examples. He's just not adding like, bisexual lighting, because and there's nothing wrong with bisexual lighting if you want to do that kind of thing, but he's not trying to appeal to people who are largely concerned with like a visual presentation. He's more about education, information, and getting that out there as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to say that up front. I really appreciate that about Noah. Also, like, it's a similar approach to what I do. He does it better. He has a nicer camera, a nicer microphone, but it's a similar approach to things.
The New York Times is one of the most popular publications in the world and the paper of record for the United States. It's also run cover for Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza.
Yes. So right off the bat, the first sentence, that's his thesis. He's not burying the lead, which is another thing that he talks about. And he's just right out of the gate. He's like, this is who the New York Post is. This is who the Washington Post is. Democracy dies in darkness. Again, that same kind of thing that Legal Eagle is doing. He just calls them out and says what they're doing. So that's good. That's good journalism, good muckraking.
It's done this with things like laundering atrocity propaganda, passively framing Israel's war crimes, deliberately avoiding the use of crucial descriptive words like genocide, and more. Today, we're going to get a small taste of that by reading through one of their beautiful pieces of journalism, an article published on March 15th titled...
Also, I want to say, when he edits his video, he cuts out the long pauses. So he has, as someone who's worked in editing before, I can't really do that myself because I can't edit in post. I can only pause and start pause and resume my recordings as I'm recording them. It's like technically I have the software, but so I'm a little lazier than Noah Samson. My videos are definitely I don't have an editor that I can hire, and I don't have the time to go through and edit out the dead air, so to speak. But he does have that in terms of his editing, but also he's able to his in terms of like his visual aids that he gives are really good, and he'll refer to them in time, and so his editing is very good. It's very punchy. It's to the point.
Titled, Israel Keeps Up Attacks in Gaza Despite Truce. Now already you may notice a bit of a problem with the headline. There's a truce, they say, but Israel is also conducting attacks in Gaza. So is there a truce, or is there not one? If there is a truce, the correct word to use in regards to Israel's conduct is violates.
Yes. So the idea with the New York Times is they're obfuscating what they're saying. They're throwing in more words. They're adding flowering language. They're saying it in a more euphemistic kind of way to make it sound like a genocide isn't happening. Israel keeps up attacks in Gaza despite truth, or you could say violates ceasefire. And the difference between one versus the other is pretty night and day.
Israel violates the truce by attacking Gaza. An attack on Gaza is a violation of the ceasefire. Any of those would do, anything other than what is written here. Israeli forces killed at least 9 Palestinians in Gaza in strikes on Saturday, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, the latest in a string of Israeli attacks on the enclave that have kept up despite a roughly 2-month-old truce with Hamas. Okay, wait, so not only did Israel violate the ceasefire, but in doing so, they killed 9 people. Why?
Yeah. And that's another thing to mention here is that this is just the Washington Post writing about this as if this is the first time that it's happened. And they're like, wow, we totally had this, and now this is the first time. When in reality, Israel's been doing this the entire time. And not just from October 7th, 2023, but since the Nakba and before. From 1948 onwards, and even before that, when the settler colony and British imperialism into American imperialism after the war, and APAC, and just everything that goes along with that in terms of funding the entire project. Like, this has been going on for over 70 years now. And but the Washington Post would have you think that this is the first time that Israel's done anything wrong, and they're not even really saying that they've done anything wrong. Is the creepy and sad part. Like, so this is whitewashing 101 for sure.
Why is this mass killing event being downgraded to simply an attack in the headline? A non-ceasefire violating attack at that? Since the ceasefire went into effect in mid-January, the military has conducted constant strikes in Gaza. Israel has accused militants of threatening its forces by laying explosive devices, flying drones, or by approaching where Israeli troops are deployed. Hamas has claimed those attacks have killed more than 150 people since the truce took effect, at least some of them civilians. And it has accused Israel of repeatedly violating the agreement by continuing military operations. So this is a good example of kind of one of the central issues in this coverage, which is that the claims from both Hamas and Israel are being given the same weight in this debate going on in the article, but only one of the figures cited here can actually be confirmed. When
Yep, absolutely. There's a huge double standard. And one thing I wanted to say too is, as we go through the rest of Noah's video, I'm probably not going to pause as much just because I tend to agree with what he says, but if I have something to say and I want to weigh in, I absolutely will. He's 100% right about the double standard, though. Like, it's a both sides kind of argument in terms of how the Washington, the New York Post in this case, I think, well, it doesn't matter. It could be either or. They write the same shit. They're treating Hamas and Israel like they're the same thing, when Israel is the tip of U.S. imperial spear and Hamas is an occupied nation trying to repel an invader that they don't want to compromise with them. They want them to get out. So it's the same problem with Jabotinsky and the Iron Wall, where the idea is that there's an iron wall behind which Israel can do whatever it wants, the Iron Dome kind of thing, and they can just attack with impunity and be the United States not just their watchdog, but their attack dog, and they're sicking the hounds on people that are in a prison. They have nowhere to go, and so this is a genocide. This is a Holocaust. So it's not a both sides issue at all. But Noah is absolutely 100% right in pointing that out.
Hamas claims that 150 people have been killed. This is a statement of fact. Israel has killed over 150 Palestinians, the vast majority of whom are civilians, including a number of children. We have the names, the video and photographic evidence of their killings, and the medical records. When Israel says that its troops were threatened, Israel provides no evidence for this claim, and yet the New York Times reports it as if it's on par with the claims made by Hamas, claims which have evidentiary backing. On Saturday, the Israeli military said it struck 2 militants who were operating a drone that posed a threat, and then struck a vehicle carrying others who had arrived to collect the drone operating equipment. It did not elaborate on how they posed a threat to Israeli troops. Oh, okay. Well, this would be good to lead with, I think, the fact that Israel gave no evidence or even explanation as to why they killed 9 Palestinians with an airstrike during a ceasefire.
Yeah, the idea is that they're normalizing it, right? They're not critiquing it. They're just presenting it like it's a weather event. Like today, we killed 9 Palestinians. Expect showers at 10. That's the idea. Is it becomes the new normal, and the reality of this situation is that I think Second Thought did a video where they, or maybe it was First Thought, their second channel, where they say that Israel Palestine is basically preparation for genocide at home, and when they start installing camps and imperialism comes home to empire through the imperial boomerang, you can expect this kind of behavior at home. So it's very important to speak out about this now, not just to speak out for the Palestinians, which is incredibly valued, and we need to do that with them, but also we need to there is an element of self-interest in this. It's just like, if you want to survive, you can't just ignore what's happening overseas, because it will come home. But also what happens at home is reflected overseas disproportionately. It's domestic genocides tend to manifest differently than those overseas, but they involve the same kinds of abuses: police abuse, power abuse. But they generally don't tend to drop bombs at home. That's more Holocaust by bullet, and it's an incarceration sort of and pandemic that's endemic to home soil specifically, but it's also a prison overseas as well. So you can analyze things on the home front and things overseas, and you can find similarities, but it's important to recognize that what's happening in terms of how they're normalizing genocide overseas will also come home to empire, and it already has. It's just it's ramping up more slowly. It's something that they have to be more careful with, but Gaza is basically practice for that.
Ismail Thawabte, the Director General of the Hamas-controlled government media office in Gaza, said the 9 Palestinians killed in the strike were working for a charity. The identities and statuses of those killed could not be independently verified. So when Palestinians report evidence, the New York Times makes sure to designate their status as a Hamas-controlled, Hamas being a U.S.-designated terrorist organization, mind you. Terrorists are controlling this government media office, that's the implication whenever they use this label, and that nothing can be verified independently. The
idea is that there's a terrorist counter-terrorist binary, and you are a counter-terrorist in terms of the state if you serve state interests, whereas if you don't, they can just basically call you whatever they want. Terrorist is one label, other, alien, illegal. There's so many different dehumanizing labels that they can use, and that's not even including monstrous language. A lot of Islamophobia gets into that. Well, we'll talk about that more when we look at the Kavernacle's video.
IDF is, of course, absent from the U.S. list of terrorist organizations, despite its many terrorist actions. That's because the U.S. makes the list, and the U.S. and Israel are the good guys, according to the U.S. and Israel. So that takes care of that double standard there. But the independent verification on their claims...
Also, it's a Darvo argument, where you have deny, accuser, reverse victim, offender, where you have the abuser who's saying, we're the victims and you're the victimizer. So that's the United States is basically anything that Israel does, they do through the influence of the United States and have since their beginning. So yeah, that's what's happening here in terms of the double standard.
Goes unmentioned. Interesting. The Israeli military said earlier on Saturday that it had struck 3 militants in central Gaza who were attempting to install explosive devices on the ground near Israeli soldiers. Officials in the Gaza Health Ministry did not respond to requests for comment. The steady drumbeat of Israeli strikes is a reminder that while Israel and Hamas have reached an agreement that paused most of the fighting in Gaza, a comprehensive truce is still nowhere in sight. In Lebanon, Israel is conducting a similar aerial campaign against the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah, a Hamas ally, during the U.S.-brokered ceasefire there, saying Israel...
So, like, one thing I want to point out, too, is they're like, how dare Hezbollah, ally to the Hamas evil people, break our U.S.-brokered ceasefire? So they're blaming it on Hezbollah. And one thing that Noah's going to talk about next here with the steady drumbeat of Israeli strikes is connotation. You can describe something different ways. You can say there's a genocide, or you could say that a bunch of people are being unalived, or one side, it's their fault. You know, there's a million different ways that you can frame the same basic thing, but some are more disingenuous. And the way that this particular article is writing it, the steady drumbeat of Israeli strikes, is like, yeah, it's musical, as opposed to, you could say, the bloodthirsty genocide that's being committed by the Israeli ethno-state. I just described the same event, but I'm describing it in a much more frank, honest way, because what they're doing is they're whitewashing it, whereas the way I describe it is the connotation is completely different.
Israeli forces are attacking sites and operatives that have breached the agreement. So the exception to the rule of, quote, most of the fighting being paused in Gaza is the steady drumbeat of Israeli strikes. Why is the steady drumbeat of Israeli strikes not the focus of this article? What a poetic way to describe something that must certainly be in violation of a ceasefire, right? Steady drumbeat? The war in Gaza began after Hamas's deadly October 7th attack on southern Israel, which killed about 1,200 people, mostly civilians, according to Israel's government.
Yeah, so again, this is blaming Hamas for trying to punch out and punch up. They're breaking out of a jail and attacking their jailers. But then they're like, think of the people around the concentration camp, the jailers, think of them, mostly civilians, when they're leaving out the fact that the number of people who had been killed by Israel, why is Hamas doing this? And Israel had imprisoned their people, killed the vast majority of them, mostly women and children. Forget militants, they're mostly targeting civilians, but most of those civilians are, over 50% of them are children and women and pregnant women, just the most vulnerable people, what Nazi Germany would call useless eaters. And so this is just all propaganda. And they're like, well, they killed one of us, so we're going to kill 1 million of them. Basically, it's extermination. And they're framing it in such a way where they're trying to justify through basically American exceptionalism that's being imitated by Israel. And it's a more radicalized form of American fascism through a proxy. But that's what's going on.
About 250 others were taken back to Gaza as hostages. The New York Times...
Another thing I want to mention, too, is that this is all based off revenge. And revenge, I will show you revenge. It's the same kind of thing where anytime you need a false flag, through reactive abuse, you kettle people until they snap, and then when they snap, to try and... the sad part about this is Hamas is also doing this not just to fight back and push back, but to raise awareness. And the moment they do, they're treated like the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. They're treated like this nation that was this giant threat to the United States. And even then, in the case of World War II, the Japanese were not a legitimate threat to the United States at any point in that war. And the United States was this giant bully, basically. And, I'm not saying that Japan wasn't fascist and imperialist and that they weren't doing awful things in China, in Manchuria, the rape of Nanking, stuff like that. But they were certainly never a threat to the United States. So what different outlets will do is they'll try and make it seem like one side is a bigger threat than they actually are, within the double standard, the Darvo, and the reactive abuse. And, oh, well, you did this. Oh, I'm so wounded right now. So now I'm going to curb stomp you, basically, is what the United States does. But they want that because it's profitable. and then they get everyone in America to play along. They did it. They've done it in every war that America has waged. They convince the home team that they're righteous, and then they find a means of both siding things through the process of abjection to encourage total revenge, total victory. They'll whitewash it through American exceptionalism, but it's just fascism dressed up.
As most Western outlets do, choose to start the clock on this war on October 7th of 2023. Did anything happen before that could have led to the conditions that may have led to such an attack? Or any other options explored, perhaps even nonviolent ones by the people who undertook it to alleviate said conditions? What happened in the preceding 70 years? Was there a brutal occupation and a repeated campaigns of ethnic cleansing, a medieval siege controlling everything that goes in and out of the Gaza Strip, repeated high-tech massacres of innocent civilians in Gaza, massacres Israel itself refers to as mowing the lawn? Is any of that relevant? Who knows? Definitely not the New York Times. Israel's subsequent
So Noah's being sarcastic, and if you just like sit through the whole video, it's really obvious, you know. So and again, I really enjoy Noah's mentioning of all of these things where they're like, oh yeah, well, just look at all these things that the New York Times is leaving out. You know, because the only way that a Darva argument works is if you leave out evidence that proves that the person making the Darva argument is actually the abuser. And that's so lies of omission, essentially.
Military campaign against Hamas has killed more than 48,000 people, including thousands of children. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, the figures do not distinguish between civilians and combatants, and the Israeli military claims to have, quote, eliminated nearly 20,000 Hamas operatives. So this is just straight up IDF propaganda right here. Weighing these claims against one another as even remotely comparable is IDF propaganda. There's no other way of putting it. The Israeli attacks in Gaza are characterized by an extremely high civilian casualty ratio in comparison with other armed conflicts in the last decades. As of January 2025, 15 months into the attacks, over 46,000 persons have been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Some 24,000 out of the 40,000 who have been identified are women, children, and older persons.
It's also, I don't know if Noah mentions it here, but that's an incredibly low estimate for over, like, it's technically correct, over 46,000, but it's in the hundreds of thousands at this point, because that number, January 2025, I mean, like that estimate was back in 2024 and before, you know. So they're killing people every day. The Terminator, right? The disposal units ran night and day. We were that close to going out forever, but there was one person who taught us to fight, to storm the wire of the camps, to smash those metal motherfuckers in the junk. In this instance, Skynet and the Terminator is Israel, and you see the wreckage of Gaza, which was not some like backwater fourth world country, and I don't say that to demean those areas that are exploited by the first world, but just that the state of Gaza's infrastructure before the occupation of Israel, you know, from the 1940s onwards, essentially was, and the Nakba and everything after that, was not devastated. You know, it was from what I understand, relatively speaking, in any event, what the West would call civilized in terms of how, you know, things weren't bombed into the Stone Age. And but that's what America and its allies, Israel, want. But they also want to obfuscate just the sheer destruction. They essentially acted, they may as well have dropped a nuke on Gaza at this point. I mean, short of dropping a nuke. They're because the reason they don't drop a nuke is because they wouldn't be able to colonize the land again after that. That's the only reason they don't do that. And, you know, for fear of nuclear escalation, obviously. But if they could get away with it, they would.
Making almost 59% of the identified fatalities. While the estimated number of combatants killed by the ISF varies, there is no doubt that civilians comprise the vast majority of the persons killed since the Israeli attacks began. According to a United States intelligence assessment from May 2024, Palestinian armed groups have lost 30 to 35% of their fighters in Gaza since October 2023. The Commission therefore estimates the death toll of Hamas and other armed groups as between 6,000 and 14,000, given an estimated strength of about 20 to 40,000 militants. months prior to October 2023.
And I also want to mention that anytime you have a land where you're trying to colonize it, and people think that a colony, once it's colonized once, it's over. No, they have to repeat it. And so what happens is, colonies have a shelf life, and they colonize it until they can no longer do that. Either they're pushed out or the cycle is complete. But then it has to repeat again and again and again. And in order to do that, you have the us versus them argument, the process of abjection that is basically incentivized through the middle class to further that process through basically maintained ignorance, but also just outright endorsement of the genocide. So in terms of the necrometrics, the Vietnam War, for instance, was waged through kill counts. We win the war when enough of the enemy are dead, but that number is completely made up, and furthermore, it's not even accurate. They just literally take a number and they're like, we've killed this many people. Those people conveniently were all the Viet Cong. In the case of the Gazans, they're all Hamas. It's the same exact idea, except the numbers don't actually accurately represent the number of people killed, and the type of numeration in terms of like the people being counted are not being accurately represented. They're not military activists. Well, they're militarized activists, but they're not largely militant. There's a militant component in terms of resistance, absolutely, but that's completely valid. But they're not all even terrorists by the United States own metric, is the point. Most of them are just women and children. And the whole point is to cattle the Gazans and to kill their women and children until they push back. The whole point is they're being bullied and pushed, and then when they push back, then they're attacked even harder to continue the genocide. And they use that argument and through bad numbers and basically non-representative data to obscure things, but also push the spear deeper into their victims.
One report estimated that 8,500 militants were killed. The ISF claimed in October 2024 that it had killed about 17,000 Hamas operatives and members of other armed groups. Given that the number of adult male fatalities since October 7th has been around 16,000, this would mean that the ISF considers all adult male Palestinians in Gaza to be members of armed groups and so legitimate targets.
A free fire zone, essentially. Basically, anyone who's in that area can be killed.
So even if the total number of male deaths were 16,000, 4,000 less than what the New York Times is so graciously quoting the IDF as saying, that still means that there are no innocent men in Gaza. The IDF has repeatedly egregiously lied about the ratios of combatants to civilians killed. The evidence we do have, far from being the most moral army in the world, it's like the least moral army in the world.
Yes. And furthermore, I just want to say, in terms of the numbers, Noah Samson is just literally taking from the horse's mouth their own numbers, and then when they are looking at those numbers, they're like, regardless of the death toll, the Gazans are being treated as a universal threat. Noah isn't trying to say that, he's not agreeing with the exact numbers, because he, if I remember correctly, cites later in this video that the kill count is actually much higher, arguably, than the incredibly conservative and disingenuous numbers given by the New York Times and various other United States organizations and even nonprofits. There are some that give much higher estimates that he also talks about.
By a long shot, the army that committed and is currently committing genocide. That's another thing that goes completely unmentioned in this article, is the whole genocide thing. Who cares about that, though? That's just a bunch of independent human rights organizations. The only credible sources on the matter are the IDF, I guess.
The IDF vis-à-vis the CIA in the United States. So there's a lot of there's a lot of subterfuge, and basically, when liberals and conservatives talk about like a shadow state, what do you think the CIA is? And there's this shadowy but tenebrous but incredibly distinct and undeniable connection between the CIA and its proxies, because that's how proxy war works. The CIA, the whole point of it is to incite these for profit. And that's all that a settler colony is. That's all colonies are, period. It's exploitation. And the United States is the mother country. And it serves the will of the elite. They're giant vampires, and they're sticking their vampire tentacles or fangs into other countries and just territories more broadly to exploit them.
Yes, there's certainly no conflict of interest there inciting them. Israeli leaders say they will not end the war against Hamas until they topple the group's rule in Gaza and the territory no longer poses a threat to Israel. Hamas has shown some willingness to give up civilian governance in Gaza, but has drawn a red line on disbanding its battalions of armed fighters. How rude of them to refuse to disband their military capabilities. It's not like that's some recognized right under international law.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, it's often recognized in ways that the paradox of these types of international laws is that you can say them as much as you want, but the United States is just going to do whatever it wants to force and lies, and those lies can be overt, they can be lies of omission, they can be whitewashing. It doesn't matter. A lie is a lie, and if it serves genocide, then it's a police action, essentially.
For an occupied group of people. Dicks. Israel and Hamas are supposed to be negotiating the next steps in the ceasefire agreement, which would involve a permanent end to the war, the release of the remaining living hostages, and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Mediators, including the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, have made little headway so far, given the entrenched disagreements between the two sides. Yeah, entrenched disagreements. Both sides have those for sure. Could there be any valid reasons for disagreement among one of the two parties? Perhaps the violation.
Yeah, so basically he's implying quite strongly that Israel is doing everything in its power, and by extension the United States' power, to make sure that those negotiations fall through. Like this is all bad faith, essentially, and that's how I would sum this up: is that the actions of police through Darvo and kettling in service to profit, therefore genocide, and raping their enemies, that they have to constantly regenerate through various us versus them arguments, require them to act in bad faith. If they just go mask off like Trump, then the odds of them being able to uphold it for long are quite low. Like, fascism is capitalism in decay, but for basically the past 70 years, the United States, in relation to Israel and the formation of that state and a so-called two-state solution, which is a bad faith proposition to start with, in order for that to work, they've had to whitewash it to some degree. But now what's happening is any attempt through the Democratic Party to be like, don't worry, guys, we have a truce, well, they're just going to violate that. And they're going to be violating that abroad, but they're also going to be doing similar things at home. So people have to take heed and fight back.
Of the ceasefire that you just spent an entire article describing, could that have anything to do with these alleged disagreements from both sides? I legitimately cannot read the New York Times without getting really angry and writing a script about it. Israeli forces remain deployed in a buffer zone inside Gaza and along the Philadelphia corridor, which runs along Gaza's border with Egypt. Under the terms of the ceasefire, Israel was supposed to have withdrawn from the Philadelphia corridor by mid-March. Oh, that's good. Thanks for the heads up. So they also are violating the ceasefire in another way, on top of the steady drumbeat of attacks. Thanks for letting us know, I guess, at the very last sentence of the article. Really cool. So what do we notice from this article here? Overall, it's just a masterclass in manufacturing consent. The New York Times passively reports clear evidence of Israel's ceasefire violations while weighing them against Israel's unverifiable defenses with long histories of fabrication and falsehood. The New York Times offers a disgustingly passive and vague recounting of the numbers, names, and circumstances surrounding the Palestinian deaths.
Yes. And I'm just pausing to be like, yep, I agree. So he shows us, basically he's kind of presenting a little skit. And he's like, okay, one side's saying this, the other side's saying this. Isn't that kind of odd? And now here's a list of what's actually going on given to us straight. And that's good.
The death toll of over 150 Palestinians includes many children, such as Ahmad Abed, a 7-year-old Palestinian boy that was killed just days ago. Crucially, though, the article makes no mention of Israel's complete blockage on humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. On March 15th, the day that this article was published, Israel had completely blocked any entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza for over 2 weeks. 2 straight weeks of no food, no water, no supplies, no housing, a recent total halt on any electricity. All of these restrictions calculated to bring about the suffering and destruction of this group of people, and all of them in direct violation of the ceasefire agreement, international law, and the ICJ's provisional measures issued against Israel to prevent the crime of genocide from taking place.
So, like, one thing that's happening, if I had to sum up Noah Sampson's video in terms of the normalizing of genocide through liberal media outlets like the New York Times, is there's a complete absence of context. They say a sentence to normalize what's going on, but then they leave out any information that might conflict with it. And that's not just like in terms of like the more bellicose stuff, in terms of dropping bombs or firing bullets or riding tanks into occupied territory, but also the denying of food. Like, again, this is a concentration camp. This is a siege. In terms of the Native Americans, several centuries ago into the present through American assigned reservations for these groups, it was deemed that it would be too costly for them to be able to just eradicate them all, because it takes bombs to do that. It takes manpower. It takes you're going to incur casualties and things like that. It's just more expensive. And genocide, the whole point of it is to serve profit. So if they can do it cheaply, one cheap method is just to starve them to death, to put them in these camps. And that's what happened with the Native Americans. That's another thing that's happening with the Gazans, except in the case of the Gazans, the military-industrial complex has, all but exploded in recent decades, certainly since like the 1960s, and when Eisenhower left office and warned against that, which again is coming from someone who was guilty of perpetrating all of these things, but he still called it out. American presidents love to do that. They'll leave office and they'll be like, yeah, we're all a bunch of assholes. Just thought you should know. Maybe don't run for office. But in terms of what's going on, starvation is a very popular method, but it's starvation on top of being bombed to death, on top of carceral violence, locking people up. So they're shooting fish in a barrel and not giving the fish any food and treating them like fish. These are people. And even if they were animals, you shouldn't do it to animals either. It's just animal cruelty is wrong. And humans are animals, and chattelizing them pursuant to genocide is just wrong. Period. There's no way to present that unless you leave out all the context and you frame it like nothing is happening. It's just a Jedi mind trick. Basically, it's a really shitty thing, and it's just as bad as what the Nazis would do. And the Nazis would employ the same tricks. Americans are Nazis in terms of the establishment. Absolutely, it's a police state. It's a settler colony. Fascism started in America from the original genocide of the Native Americans onwards. Instead of go west, young man, with Lebensraum, it was go east, young man. But it was the same idea. And now it's like America has the ability, for the time being anyways, to drop bombs on people. And the whole reason this setup exists is that they can create a circular war for as long as they possibly can and lie about it for as long as they possibly can. And it's an awful thing. But Noah is stating all of these things. I'm sorry I keep interrupting him. And really, I'm responding to him and trying to just lean in and analyze it and give my thoughts, because I think that he does really excellent work. And you should absolutely go and watch his video. You should obviously support him on Patreon because he does excellent work. I don't really disagree with anything that he says in his video. And, he just straight up says his thesis at the start, and he's able to sort of supply that with a little bit of like sarcasm and, through connotative writing. But he collocates that with, in terms of the stuff that he's listing now.
To the New York Times, none of this is important. The fact that 6 babies have frozen to death due to the harsh conditions, lack of fuel, and lack of housing, all a direct result of Israel's aid blockage, completely man-made deaths, all of that is unimportant to the New York Times. To end this video today, I want to turn briefly to the newspaper Haaretz. Haaretz is the...
Okay, so I feel like we've covered the aspect of how liberal media in the West normalizes genocide. Haaretz is the Israeli newspaper. They're a part of the West, but it's basically saying Haaretz is a newspaper that is being more open and honest about the genocide going on than the New York Times is. So it's definitely something worth watching. But I think you get the point of Noah's video. You should definitely watch the whole thing. The part about Haaretz is interesting too. But basically, he says, oh, well, Haaretz is saying more than the liberal media in the West is saying, better watch out. Israel might say that they're Hamas. And again, he's being sarcastic, but also not. Like, there's a bit of a sardonic tone there. He's cynically mocking the Israeli newspaper, but at the same time, he's not wrong. You know, the more radical Israel becomes, the more bloodlust that they have, the more full, in effect, the genocide becomes, the less people will be allowed to speak out at all. It will become, the attack dog will become rabid, essentially, and then it not only won't come to heel for its master, but it'll also injure itself. So definitely worth watching. What I thought we would do now, though, is talk about another aspect of the genocide, which is just the racism against Muslims, Islamophobia. This, of course, is nothing new from the Crusades of the Middle Ages, leading into basically the opposition to the Ottoman Empire and various other Islamic countries and organizations and just nation states, what have you, into the 20th century and beyond. Islamophobia is something where the Protestant ethic under capitalism is something that is fundamentally Christian, even if it's been secularized in terms of a Puritan ethic can apply to secularized groups, and the American middle class doesn't actually have to go to church. Their church is the church of work. Work is holy, and part of that is being bigoted pursuant to genocide. Genocide itself, it takes work. It takes work to squeeze blood from a stone, or just the life force, the sanguine, out of not just an individual, but an entire population, entire territory. That takes energy, that takes work. But the Kavernacle in particular is talking about racism against Muslims and being out of control on social media. So I thought we would go over this a little bit. I don't know if we'll watch the entire thing, but he talks about, like, if we look at the footnotes, this is pure racism. This is everywhere. It targets politicians. The different waves of anti-Islam hate from 1979 to 2025. And that's important because, if I remember correctly, Edward Said wrote Orientalism in 1978. So basically from the oil crash of 1973 onwards, and the decay of embedded liberalism and Bretton Woods into neoliberalism, the generation of an enemy, a dark enemy that includes communists, but also Arabs and the Muslim faith more broadly. So anti-Islam rhetoric had only ramped up through the kinds of revenge arguments that were incurred by America, but also Russia and Afghanistan, the Russian Vietnam, and through the Cold War, as Russia began to decay and invade different countries, not just the Ukraine, but also Afghanistan. And the United States invaded Afghanistan twice. And, proxy wars and funding through the CIA, different dictatorships to rise up, and the coaching and the funding and the cultivation of different rebel factions, the Iran-Contra affair, but various other rebel factions, that it's a form of rebellion that's bought and paid for by the United States. It's basically a rebel aesthetic, but is point in fact regressive, reactionary mercenaries that through privatization and proxy war and all the obfuscation that goes along with that is essentially what has also happened basically from the 1970s onwards. He also says it's common in the UK and how to have good faith criticism of Islam. So I guess we can watch this as well. I'm going to try and get through the whole thing, and then we'll probably skip the Hasan video. I think we've gone over enough today, but we will go through the entire Kavernacle video. And before we do, I just want to say that generally speaking, I really like the Kavernacle in terms of their content. I can't really think of any of their material off the top of my head. I'll just open up their channel real quick. The same way that we did with the Legal Eagle, but the Kavernacle is a communist, and he's an Irish Republican, and or his heritage is certainly of that. And so he talks about, his channel is a much, it's more of a podcast, a guy sitting in front of a microphone. He's not a practicing lawyer, but he does have his master's in international relations and history. So he's a bit more educated than a lot of YouTubers are, and he's educated formally, but he's also educated in terms of his activism. Like, he's just active, and if you're active, you're woke in the ironic or the original usage of that word. You're conscious in terms of class, culture, and race war, and so the Kavernacle talks about that. And I also mentioned race in regards to him. He's sympathetic to and you'll see that with the Irish and the Palestinians in terms of rejecting like British versus American imperialism, and the British are complicit with American imperialism as well. There tends to be a lot of solidarity in terms of the Irish and other oppressed groups around the world. And there is a racial component to that because the Protestants treated the Irish Catholics during Cromwell and the genocide of the Irish in the 1600s as a racial component. A racial component was added to a religious group. And, they effectively, some of the earliest examples of genocide, apart from like Christopher Columbus and some of the island territories and Turtle Island, what's called the United States now, was incurred domestically by the English against the Irish. So the Kavernacle does really good content. And he talks about a lot of different things. He talks about Elon Musk a little bit. He talks about the Cybertruck and the far right. So he definitely talks a lot about Elon Musk, of course, but he also talks about just different aspects of what's trending, if I'm being honest. But he also talks about, in his video, critiquing a lot of different politicians, not just conservatives like RFK Jr., but also liberalism. And let's see if I can find some instances. Yeah, 1 year of genocide in the West, keeps supporting it. And then he has a thumbnail of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So he's definitely critiquing establishment politics on both sides of the aisle, so Democrats and Republicans, and just the corporations that are attached to them, so nation states and the state apparatus, but also the corporate model that serves profit through the state and its police mechanisms, official but also stochastic through corporate media. So the Kavernacle is a good channel for sure. But in any event, now we're gonna watch some of his video. And we'll see what he says. I haven't seen this one, so we'll give it a watch here.
So I must say thank you to you for all of that.
Also, Keir Starmer, from what I understand, he's leading New Labour. I think I could be wrong, but he's the point of me mentioning that is that he's a relatively, he's a centrist. He's a neoliberal. He's fairly conservative, and he's trying to basically push back against genocide a little bit by being more positive towards Muslims in Britain. And the point of the Kavernacle is and what he's talking about here is he's these screen caps are people who are responding to this YouTube short. I think it's a YouTube short, or maybe it's TikTok. But in any event, people are responding to Keir Starmer, who's not even, he's not even progressive. He's like a centrist at best, which is to say a fascist with more masks. And he's trying to basically do some lip service to Muslims in Britain, and these people are having some really mask-off moments.
And particularly what I know has been a very difficult time for Muslims here in the United Kingdom.
Today I want to talk about just the insane, overwhelming hatred of Muslims online. Islam is a religion that has been heavily racialized. Now, if you're still one of those people, maybe a centrist atheist who says, oh my god, my criticism of Islam has nothing to do with racist stereotypes and stuff. And I know a lot of atheists say that. Even if you don't think that,
well, if you go back to 9/11 and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and various other, I think they were called the New Atheists, because there's a YouTube movement, and then there's there's New Atheists, and then there's another group, one name that refers to basically mainstream critics like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, but then and Sam Harris and various other people like that, like basically white moderates with an atheist bent, who wound up being incredibly Islamophobic. So again, they're not even that radical. And then there's the YouTube side of it, which is the same idea, it's just on YouTube. They would try and make these arguments like, I'm just critiquing the religion. Well, you can't critique Islam without critiquing, by and large, these racial groups that have been tied to it through American geopolitics and foreign policy, built on older forms of Islamophobia. It's just a thing. And it is possible, I imagine, that the Kavernacle will go into this to critique the religion and recognize that, it's criminogenic insofar as if there are things to critique about Islam overseas or domestically, just wherever. I've known people who have dated Muslim men, for instance, and yeah, there is going to be a culture shock, and they do have more traditional values and stuff like that. But if those values are more radical and they are more harmful, it is most certainly criminogenic and tied to genocide that's incurred by the United States. And then when these things happen, it's a form of kettling, where they use that as an excuse to ramp up the policing of these groups through a racialized argument. Absolutely, 100%.
There is a high chance that you have been influenced by the news media environment in the Western world, and at the same time, if you do genuinely just have criticisms of the faith and how it's practiced in certain places, aren't going to feel called out in this video, because I'm specifically focused on racist hate against Muslims, largely in Western countries. And actually right now, it's one of the main things that is helping fascist politicians get in power, demonizing all Muslims, and specifically this racist caricature of some sort of violent Muslim man from Pakistan or North Africa or something who's coming to destroy Western civilization. Now,
yeah. So the idea with that, through the process of abjection, you have a us versus them argument, where you have some kind of dark homewrecker with men of color. You have, the black rapist. It's the same exact idea with the infidel, the interloper, the invader, the alien. That applies to the barbarian horde argument, the barbarians at the gate, the enemies at the gate, Hannibal invading Rome. That is applied to Muslims specifically, often Muslim men, but they're fetishized in a way. It's the male rapist is a form of fetishization, the same way that women are exotified, but it's inverted, because women are generally fetishized as, harem occupants, prostitutes, princesses, Princess Jasmine from Aladdin, something like that, whereas Muslim men are generally seen as scimitar-wielding banditti, and but it's still racism, it's still fetishistic, absolutely.
Now, we actually saw this recently with J.D. Vance talking about Germany importing millions of refugees who are going to fundamentally destroy Western civilization and German culture. Like, this is actually like Nazi rhetoric. And Joseph Goebbels actually said something similar in regards to Jews, because what we're seeing right now as well with what's happening in Gaza is historically modern fascism has centered a lot of its hate towards Jewish people.
Before I respond to what he's saying here, I just wanted to also say, it popped into my head, one thing that I like about the Kavernacle is that he's able to talk about popular media and find allegory within it. So, like, he has a poster of Blade Runner 2048 on his wall, and it's like, okay, that's kind of cool. But then, sanctions on Israel, and he, so he very much is putting his money where his mouth is, and he has various other things that he'll talk about as well, and it's very much a situation where he's very upfront about his political beliefs. He doesn't have as many visual aids outside of that. Like, his visual aids are literally just the paraphernalia in the background of his video, and he doesn't have his, like, in the case of Noah Samson, where Noah Samson will be talking, and then suddenly he'll have an image just pop up on screen. So that requires a bit more editing, and a lot of times the Kavernacle, his content is similar to mine insofar as I'm just literally sitting in front of a microphone looking at a screen, and like, I think the Kavernacle, he definitely has a few visual aids, but he doesn't do as many as Noah Samson does sometimes in his videos. But it's just a particular style, and he links and recommends different videos and things like that, but it's definitely looser, more conversational.
What we're seeing right now is a lot of modern fascism swap that out, and they center it around Muslims, mainly refugees, but it could be anyone of the Muslim faith in Western countries.
Yeah, so you're swapping out the scapegoat, and you can even have the same kind of arguments, like witch hunting, blood libel, and sodomy arguments, and just rape arguments more broadly. Those are all modular, which means that they can intersect and they can be used together. And in terms of swapping out different groups to receive those arguments through a police state, instead of having a Jewish scapegoat during World War II, which was a revival of blood libel through Jewish people, you can have the same exact arguments with Arabs and Muslim people, where they're being treated as bloodthirsty, child-eating, rapist, vampire werewolves. It's the same kind of arguments, and so the Kabernacle's absolutely right about that. And this is something that's been going on for a long time, and even in his own video description, he'll talk about it basically from 1979 onwards. And 1979 and the rise of neoliberalism saw the rise of a lot of different bigotries and revenge arguments across the world, preparing for the New World Order through popular media. And in that, basically the rise of video game culture from the mid-80s onwards. Video games had been made basically from the oil crash onwards. From 1972, I believe, was Pong. 1973 onwards, there were various. The first shooter was in 1973. The first D&D style kind of D&D itself, edition 1, was 1974. So from that decade into neoliberalism and onwards, you had a rise of various bigotries that use the same persecution networks. And so you can have different kinds of bigotry going on at the same time. You can have Islam and Muslims being treated to blood libel, sodomy, and witch hunt persecution language alongside Jewish people, but I would argue that Jewish people aren't receiving that to nearly the same extent as Muslim people are right now. There's an element of Jewish establishment in the United States with like AIPAC and the American film industry through Hollywood. There's a lot of Jewish directors that speak out in favor of Israel, and senators who are pro-Israel, and they could have ties to Israel, or even just like Kiss, where Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are both Jewish, and they would be like, well, we were genocided against, but then keep it simple, stupid, where they're basically billionaires at this point. They have like $500 million between the two of them. They're incredibly rich, so the profit motive has taken root in the minds of people like that versus actually speaking out against genocide. So they're gentrified, which means that their values, if ever they spoke out against genocide, has decayed substantially, and they're no longer good allies.
And what this is translated to is the overwhelming normalization of just saying terrible shit about Muslims, and it's just from your everyday people.
So instead of through corporate media with Noah Samson, the Kabernacle's talking about it from the point of view of regular people.
The profiles I was clicking on of people just pushing so much anti-Muslim racist hate were just like the most average people ever. And when they feel this emboldened to say that much racist stuff, you just know it's become such a huge problem.
And he's talking, I think, specifically about people in the UK, because that's where he's from. But you see the same kind of thing, where hatred of other groups through the process of objection, the middle class, attacking the underclass, is something that you see in the state of Israel. While that kind of the absorption and projection of that viewpoint, not just out into foreign spheres on on the frontiers of capital, because capital and genocide is a frontier affair, you'll see that kind of frontier mentality and the territory mentality regressing towards empire. Fascism comes home to empire. They'll embody the same kind of radical thought.
I actually made a video, it's one of my most popular videos. I talked about anti-Indian hate, and this is pretty similar. And actually, ironically enough, a lot of this anti-Muslim hate is actually done by Indians in India who are Hindu nationalist supporters of Modi's government.
Yes. So with marginalized infighting, a huge part of it is they'll tokenize. Now, it's the same idea as Jewish police during the Holocaust, where they'll be like, I can load the bodies into the furnace as long as they might not even escape the flames. They'll just be the last ones to go in. So that kind of tokenization is very common. You see that with TERFs versus trans people, and you can also see it, with trans minorities who tokenize as well. That happens where they'll critique. You'll see trans people who are in favor of Israel. There's not as many of them because, frankly, there's not as many trans people, and I think it's the more marginalized you are, the less likely you are to tokenize. But the ones who do tokenize really fucking hard.
And obviously, a lot of this is also done by Israel supporters, and this includes many Western leaders and politicians who are gleeful that they now get to demonize all Muslims as these savages who are incompatible with Western civilization.
Yes. So, and it's divide and conquer. It's something that goes all the way back to antiquity, basically from Rome onwards. I'm sure it happened with Sparta and Athens and various other city-states from the period. I mean, Rome was a city-state as well, but Rome's ability to expand was more notable than, say, Athens or Sparta. Those were relatively small by comparison from what I understand. But the idea of having this monolithic threat that you can demonize, this could be women and Amazons and Amazonimachia, but also just any enemy of the state that needs to exist to justify the existence of the state through secret or open police and paramilitary, but also just the arguments of the citizens, where they surrender their power to the state in defense of the state, will conduct genocide for the state. And, Rome kind of existed before profit as we think of it nowadays in terms of like the generation of wealth, but the same basic structure was there in terms of imperialism through military conquest, and profit as we think of it through the means of production in factories and things like that, as opposed to just slave labor. Like the ability for them to hook that up to military conquest has obviously become much more refined now, as opposed in the days of the Roman emperors, but it had to evolve into itself out of antiquity. But the bigotry also evolved, because racism as we think of it now is something that didn't exist during the classic Roman period. You had us versus them, but if you had someone who was a person of color and they were born a Roman citizen, they were a Roman citizen. Slaves could, serve out their term, from what I understand, and if they gave birth to someone who in the empire, then that person would be emancipated. And I'm sure that there are historical exceptions to that, and it might not be the case across the entire empire, depending on who was emperor and so on and so forth, and then the Senate versus the, and the Republic versus, the imperial period, which came after, and from Caesar into the emperors who followed, and then the breaking up of the Roman Empire into the Reichs and nation states through kingdoms and monarchies into corporations from the Enlightenment onwards after the Renaissance. So there's a lot of different stuff going on. But in terms of the way that these languages of alienation exist now, in terms of monsters and demonizing people, absolutely, the idea of a homogenous barbarian at the gates rhetoric that is propagated through Cartesian thoughts over colonialism and heteronormativity, my argumentation, is something that definitely is much more widespread now.
Before we go any further, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Blue Sky and on Instagram, and please support me on Patreon and YouTube memberships. This is what inspired the video. There's some sort of like self-help influencer called Usman Unchained, and I saved this like maybe a couple months ago. So he wrote a post and he says 7 reasons why Muslim men struggle with women and give off pervy vibes. So he's giving Muslim men help on being less pervy, right? So can I just say one thing? When Sam Harris and others used to talk about like how we're going to live with Islam because it's so incompatible with Western society, they would say there has to be Muslims who like try and progress their community and try and help them move away from all the terrible things they do. And if we don't have moderate Muslims, then we're doomed as the human race because Islam's going to destroy us all.
So it's a form of assimilation. It's like, okay, if we act less rapey, then they won't attack us, which is you're basically appealing to the colonizer and saying, you know what, you're right, colonizer, we colonized our rapey, but we'll do better. It's just a form of assimilation, which means that it can be used to grift, but also triangulate different groups against each other during divide and conquer and kettling and reactionary violence and so on and so forth. So, all of this stuff comes together and cycles through boom and bust, through profit, genocide, the raping of different groups that are deemed through Cartesian thought, for instance, as extended beings. They're not white enlightened men. The Kavernacle RE mentioned Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and people like that, where the white civilized man, basically from Columbus onwards, who would make these kind of value judgments. And in Columbus's case, he was bloodthirsty in an open kind of way to divine right, essentially, in selling the early forms of settler colonialism to his peers, his employers back at home, the crown. Whereas in terms of the way that it is being practiced nowadays, or even, I say nowadays, but 9/11, happened over 20 years ago, and so this isn't like new. This is yesterday's what happened yesterday's leftover rice, but it's still ongoing. It never stopped. It only escalated, which is the whole point of what George Bush Jr. called the New World Order after Reagan left office. And as far as that goes, it's very much something to take in mind when people are making these arguments, insofar as we need to assimilate, we need to tokenize, like this influencer that the Kavernacle is talking about. You don't want to do that because it will always basically put most of the people into concentration camps, where they'll be attacked, they'll be lynched, a Holocaust in some shape or form will be executed against them, whether it's on the fringes of society, gradually bleeding inwards towards the in-group, domestically or abroad. It's like these happen at the same time. And this kind of radical thinking, policing these groups, will, once they get in here, it's over, pal. So you got to push back against that. You don't want to normalize this kind of thinking. And that's what this grifter is doing, that the Kavernacle is talking about.
So we've had all that rhetoric for a long time, and here's a guy who, in his own way, is trying to help the stereotype of all Muslim men being perverts and stuff.
Yep.
And the comments are still just abusing him. He writes a list in the description. He gives numbers.
Well, and it's also important to mention that token people are, through like a prison sex mentality, are treated lower on the pecking order. So those above them, even if just barely above them, you could have like poor white trash, for instance, that are low on the totem pole in terms of, Western society. They could be blue collar, uneducated people. They will turn to this person and just completely kick the shit out of them to maintain the status quo. But then this person will be like, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" Yes, you're absolutely right. It's a servant's mentality. He's the harem guard, basically. It's Orientalism, but it's internalized bigotry that is through tokenization, and he's grifting. He's probably he's privileged enough and leaning into that to try and make these arguments to make money, and it's out of desperation and convenience for him to do so. But it doesn't change the fact that tokenization is still harmful. It leads to people, regardless if you're token or not, attacking him and then going out and attacking other people in the same oppressed groups.
Numbered advice saying like unrealistic standards, you want her to tick all the boxes. Ask yourselves, would you tick all of her boxes? Probably not. Lack of experience, you never learned how to speak to a woman because mummy had you wrapped up in a comfort blanket and your dad told you hell was awaiting you for every mishap. Red pill misguidance, the red
it almost has like a pickup artist kind of feel to it, like, except it's tokenized. And it's like pickup artists will oftentimes have some good advice. It's like, look, you do need to temper your expectations when dating, period. But the thing is he's couching that within a tokenized form of grifter Islamophobia, and it's possible. And he does talk about red pill misguidance. Don't marry an older woman. Don't get married altogether. The red pill has its truths, but it's definitely fucked the minds of many. So it's very checkered, But in reality, it's like, the way that he's framing this, like the language is very much fetishistic. Muslim men struggle with women and give off pervy vibes, emojis, and it's like, or you could say Islamophobia is a problem, like the Kavernacle is doing. You want to address the ideology, not the symptoms.
red pill has its truths, but it has definitely fucked the minds of many. I'm not dying on the hill of advocating for everything this guy says, but if we're taking the most extreme stereotypes that we're fed in Western media of all Muslim men being pervert misogynists who just want like some sort of slave or something, right? This guy going out of his way to try and give advice should be seen as a good thing.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, and regardless of what you're looking at, you could be reading Edward Said's Orientalism, or you could be reading Hitler's Mein Kampf, or Milton's Paradise Lost. It really doesn't matter. You could look at any piece of media. There's going to be good and there's going to be bad, generally speaking. No one is 100% right all the time. And even if you're right consistently about a specific topic, you might not mention other topics. There's knowledge gaps. That's just inevitable. Unless, you're incredibly holistic and you work very hard and very active to fight that, it's going to occur. And even then, it's still going to happen. So the Kavernacle is absolutely right about that as well.
And be encouraged within his own community, right? Because he understands the issues, he understands the discourse way better than any of us do, because we didn't grow up in that community. We don't understand it. And then you just get comments like this. So marrying your 9-year-old first cousins probably doesn't help. We've seen the abuse and the grape statistic.
You also have to keep in mind that there's a double standard, because they're like, oh, well, you're the pedophile. You're the one who marries underage people, even though in the United States, certain states within the union are, have marriage that's legal at like 14, I think. And don't ask me which state it is, but there are states where you can basically marry someone who's the age of Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. So that's definitely something that is, it's hypocrisy. It's boundaries for me, not for thee. And what they do is they make those kinds of arguments to do the Hawthornian thing, where it's a very puritanical approach to labor, where they'll be like, you're the devil worshiper, and then you find out in Young Goodman Brown that everyone else is actually a hypocrite, and they're the ones doing the things that they're accusing other people of. And there's a dualistic component to the language, and it's something that we could reclaim through the language of monsters, but that's, a conversation that we could conduct through my work. But just the idea that there's a lot of hypocrisy, because these people, it's very pot, meat, kettle, except the people that are making the accusations are far more privileged than the person that they're punching out against.
You literally marry 6-year-olds. Bye. Islam doesn't see women as equals. Muslim men follow this idea, but modern society has given strength and empowerment to women. Your prophet also marries 9-year-olds. Maybe it's that y'all don't respect women. Randomly exploding in public places doesn't help your plight either. Have you tried not allowing...
Unless Israel does it with the phone chargers. No, in their case, they weren't using suicide bombers. They were selling pagers with bombs to other people. But, Israel can do terrorism, or the United States and its police apparatus can do terrorism. And I'm not saying it's okay for, unironic misogyny and various other forms of bigotry to be committed crimiноgenically by various Muslim groups, but at the same time, if there's a difference between that kind of stuff, which happens on a much smaller basis compared to what the United States does, for instance, versus freedom fighters that are pushing back against Israel, for instance. So there's just a lot of different things going on in terms of all of this. But here it's a pretty plain double standard.
Muslim men to marry 9-year-olds. I'd start there. Pervy incel religion creates pervy incel men because they hate women.
Again, Christianity is also guilty of that, but you don't see them attacking Christianity because it's the Puritan ethic.
Women. Stay out of the West. Problem solved. So what you saw there is basically all the comments. Just real, mask off racism, talking about, exploding in public, talking about how all Muslims don't respect women, talking about it being an incel religion, and which is just so ironic, and I think just shows you the hypocrisy. Nearly everything they just said there, you can direct right at nearly all American conservatives, especially right now, and...
Well, not just American conservatives, people who would call themselves conservative, but people who are functionally conservative, which includes liberals, also includes progressives to a certain extent. It's like, just because someone calls themselves progressive, Ian Kaczynski calls himself progressive, but he's functionally not. Kamala Harris is conservative, even if they say that they're a Democrat. They're just a moderate Republican, ergo a moderate Nazi. They're just a Nazi with more masks, basically. That's how American liberalism works. That's how centrism works. The creation of an enemy, and the oscillation of good versus evil. There are moral teams, and then there are teams that are deserving of genocide, and good versus evil arguments, the process of abjection, etc.
And how people like Matt Walsh and others are talking about ending no-fault divorce, wanting to control women, wanting to repeal women's right to vote in America. That is actually a pretty popular thing online to talk about.
Yes, and so they'll basically critique one side for doing these things, but then they'll be fighting to do the same thing themselves. What they're fighting for is control, specifically over women or people forced to identify as women. They want breeders for the state, basically Immortan Joe from Fury Road. Think of Sparta, right? Sparta needs police, and it needs people who give birth to have babies for the state. So Saxon force, the ancient language of the Imperium, into the present. So that's basically what they're pushing for, and they're doing it through a modern media apparatus, but it's the same exact end game that they have, and that includes through material conditions, but also the social element as well.
And for some reason, a guy who's trying to help Muslim men have better success with women in terms of working on themselves, gets all this hate directed at him. He hardly even spoke about Islam. He just directed this advice at the Muslim male community. But again, they just feel emboldened. When someone is a visible Muslim man like this guy, he starts talking about something that is related to Islam. Everyone thinks they can just be really, really racist to him.
Yeah, he's a scapegoat. The idea is they're emphasizing, the class, the racial divisions. They're punching down to perform and illustrate their role in society. They're enforcing the hierarchy of values in ways that, it's not just rhetorical, it's also through force. If they were in front of this person, they would probably punch him in the face and then film it. They would lynch him if they were allowed to. So acknowledging all this and speaking up before that starts happening is vital.
And again, that is Instagram, right? So that isn't even the hell site that is Twitter. We'll get to Twitter. That is just Instagram.
All right. So the idea that this is everywhere, and he's just mentioning Instagram, but he also talks about Twitter is basically just a more aggressive form of that. So I don't think we have to go over that. And he also goes over the different waves of Islam hate and how it's really common in the UK in terms of, how people are treated over there, and how to have good faith criticism of Islam. So I think we're going to skip the rest of of this. And I also have a tendency to do this with the Kavernacle's videos. They're less scripted, so and he has a tendency to just kind of go off the cuff. He'll kind of organize things in terms of like he'll break up the different sections in terms of bookmarks that you can jump around the timestamps, and which is definitely useful. But then it's very conversational, and it's good for having some quick, easy content. And if you just need something to listen to while you're cooking or working, driving from point A to point B, or you're just chilling and you need to hear someone's voice talking about something, his content's pretty good. But usually I'll get like partway through the video and then I'm like, okay, I get the point. And so I will say that about the Kavernacle. My attention span tends to waver with him a little bit more just because his videos are more freeform. I'm sure people would say the same thing about my videos, and it's not strictly a negative, it just depends what you want. I tend to prefer videos that are a little bit more, not just organized, but they have more visual aids and they're a little bit more succinct. Like in the case of the Kavernacle, his style is very much akin to mine, and it's not something that holds my interest. Like I would respond more to like if I'm gonna give something my full attention, I need to be able to see like the thesis and like the video, like an essay kind of format, something where I can be like, okay, from start to finish there's kind of a structure to it, whereas he's more freeform. So we went over the ubiquity of this kind of racism and just tokenism as it occurs, and just we're gonna skip the history of it for now. We can go over this more in a future video, obviously, but just like I do have some other things that I have to get around to doing, so I need to skip ahead. We're going to skip to that it's common in the UK. The UK has a history of fascism just like the United States, obviously. So let's go to how to have good faith criticism of Islam.
I just want to talk about atheism and criticizing religion and not falling into these racial biases when it comes to Islam specifically. Like, I don't want to make this a really long-winded thing about religion and criticizing religion. So as an atheist and as someone who is against most religions, I realize that a lot of these religions have the same core. Abrahamic religions are all homophobic, misogynistic, pro-patriarchy, all that stuff. It's society, economics, and everything about how these religions get interpreted and how these religions are believed by the public. So
yes, and it is worth noting that these religions are critiqued differently. So just in Gothic media, if you critique Christianity, generally you'll critique like the pedophile priest, for instance, or the possessed nun, the angel in the streets, devil in the sheets kind of thing. So you're gonna see that in horror films a lot, where they'll displace it or they'll abject it to like a former time, like Valak from The Conjuring 2, the evil nun, that kind of thing. Like it's something that is pushed off onto an evil portrait, as opposed to critiquing the Pope and the Vatican and just Catholicism around the world, which is much more homogenized than Protestantism. Obviously, there's so many denominations of Protestantism compared to Catholicism, and Puritanism is a form of Protestantism, and Protestants are puritanical. So there's that, and that's much more of an American thing, the Christofascism. Whereas Catholicism and fascism, you'd see that in South America, from what I understand. Depending on the form of fascism, there's going to be different religious groups. In Nazi Germany, they had an anti-Christian approach to things with paganized elements and the occult. The degree to which that was going on, I'm not entirely sure, but basically they were paganizing Christianity, similar to a revival of the Roman Empire, basically. And there was a hauntological element, obviously, but so yeah, and all of these are going on at the same time. So in terms of Islamophobia in media and Orientalism, and then anti-Semitism in media, anti-Semitism, Jewish influence and Zionism in Hollywood is something that kind of prevents anti-Semitism a little bit. Like if you watch a Spielberg film, for instance, obviously the Jewish voice is given a certain voice, but then they'll be punching down against Arabs in those movies, or they'll talk about an exclusively Jewish struggle of the Holocaust and omit queer people or people of color in Schindler's List. So anti-Semitism is something that's conducted by token Jewish people, for instance. So there's definitely things worth critiquing about these different groups and the way that they are conducted with or without irony vis-a-vis mainstream media as a part of just the media apparatus more broadly for furthering genocide versus exposing it.
So if you even take a country like Egypt as a good example, a country that doesn't like Islamicism, a lot of Islamicism thrives in Egypt in the poorer rural communities. The same in Afghanistan as well.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. I know that there are Arabs that live in these different countries, but you could be Arab and not a Muslim, for instance. And I'm not as familiar. There's a lot of colonial residue and just ongoing proxy elements to the Middle East, but they'll often be Christianized. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, from what I understand, with the ruling class in that particular country, the Saudis are basically Western allies, and from what I understand, there's going to be an Islamophobic component to that, because you can't be a Western ally without being Islamophobic. And the idea that the persecuted groups are pushed into the poorer groups, the groups that are used to being exploited normally anyways. So yeah, that tracks for sure.
And why do they thrive in these poor rural communities? People are less educated, people are poorer, they follow tradition that is set in like older ways, and they don't really have much of a change in their life, and they don't have access to things we take for granted, like freedom of information, like economic prospects and stuff like that. So a lot of these countries will just stay like that. But again, it's always impacted by a culture.
And also it's criminogenic. It's like these countries are forced into these positions. Imagine the golden age of Islam, and then the Mongols show up and burn down Baghdad and kill like over 1 million people, and it's one of the bloodiest conflicts, battles in history, up there with like Stalingrad, except it's divided by like 800 years, and it was just this tremendous sacking of this center, and it's basically being dragged down into this state of barbarity by the invaders. In this case, the colonizers. The Mongols colonized through force, and so criminogenically, if you tear a nation down and you keep it torn down, it's going to behave in ways that are conservative. And a lot of Muslim culture in proxies in the Middle East more broadly under an Orientalism more broadly sort of hegemon are going to experience these effects. The United States wants to do this because they don't want these nations to develop and become conscious of the colonizer. And that's just what's happening in Gaza is happening all around that part of the world. And, it's going to affect other nations too. And it's not just exclusive to Islam, but Islam is definitely feeling the brunt of it. Like religiously speaking, I would say that they're the main punching bag. You're not going to see the same instance in regards to fear of Indians and the nation of India. You're not going to see the same degree of pushback against Jewish people, obviously because of Israel, and the mainstream religions. You're not going to see it in regards to Buddhism, just any other sort of large religion that you could think of, or Christianity for that matter. Obviously, like Islam is definitely feeling the brunt of that. Basically, from 9/11 onwards, the war on terror was largely against Islam, not Jewish people. And Jewish people fought that. And those Jewish people are functionally Christianized and behaving in a Western kind of way. So if you tokenize, doesn't matter who you are, you're acting like the colonizer, which is to say a white, cishet, Christian man, European man, first and foremost. And then, that's modular, obviously. So you can remove components, which is basically, a gradient from conservatism and fascism to moderacy and progressivism and centrism, kind of in the middle of all of that towards the left. That's how a spectrum works.
Are you going to tell me that Islamic clerics in Iran are the same as a Muslim in Thailand who works in a 7-Eleven, right? Of course they're going to be different, and in some cases they're going to be completely different. Malaysia versus Pakistan, Malaysia versus Bangladesh.
Yes, absolutely. These, depending on where you are, very different cultures. These are transplants, and they're going to take differently, and they're going to absorb different qualities. They're going to assimilate differently, and you're going to find when you're critiquing this kind of stuff, it's like Anita Sarkeesian in popular media. It's both possible to enjoy various aspects of media, but also to critique their problematic elements. Same idea with any religion, you could, or race attached to religion and the national nation state character of a religion. Even if historically Jewish people weren't nationalized, now they certainly are, at least in relation to Zionism and Jewishness as being, the validation of Jewishness is through Israel in mainstream discourse. And then in regards to the demonization of Islam, it's tied to these countries that, wouldn't you know it, the United States is colonizing. So there's definitely a nation state character to all of that. But when you're critiquing these things, you can find good aspects of religion, like Christian mercy isn't automatically a bad thing, and various tenets or virtues of Judaism and their treatment of demons and demonology is quite interesting. They're not about persecuting demons, is a good thing, I think. So the idea of demonizing and persecuting demons is actually a very Christian thing. And if you see, tokenized variants of that in witch hunts in other cultures, by and large, it's because they've assimilated or they've been tokenized and they've been downtrodden to the point that it's criminogenic. In Islam, misogyny and the patriarchal elements of that are a thing, but they're also influenced by American and British policy, e.g. Lawrence of Arabia, for instance, something like that. So there's a lot of foreign influence, so it muddies the waters. But these are people and they are autonomous to a certain degree, and even if it's criminogenic, we can still recognize that they're making decisions within the limitations of their culture and how they're being colonized. Just because you're being colonized doesn't give you the right to rape women. And I'm not saying that all Arabs rape women, obviously. I think it's a very small minority who actually do that. And if you do see that, tenets within, radical Christendom or radical Islam, for instance, again, we're talking about a radical form, a regressive form of a religion that's being kettled. So I'm going to critique it accordingly. But, just Muslims more broadly, Islam more broadly, I'm not going to paint with the same brush any more than I might look at a Methodist Christian and judge them the same way that I might the Church of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Baptists, which is a much more radical form of Christianity, or Puritans more broadly. So we should give them the same tolerances and leniency and the same gradient of criticism that we would ourselves. I'm not even Christian, I'm a Satanist, but I'm still going to critique other Satanists like Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, or the leader of the Satanic Temple. I forget his name off the top of my head. Like these are people that I would critique the same way. So it's like we need to hold everyone accountable, and it's not boundaries for me, but not for thee. But everyone needs to be held to the same standard. And so I think the Kavernacle is absolutely right about that.
African-American Muslim in New York versus someone in the Taliban, right? You can see there is so much difference, but they're both Muslim. So we can't see
Yes, absolutely.
Muslims as a monolith who all believe in the same things as the Taliban, but because in the Western countries, our exposure is mainly to the more radical elements, we just think all Muslims are like that. Again, there has to be a level of dehumanization in society to make you okay with brutalizing refugees and destroying a whole country for colonialism in the case of Israel and Gaza. You have to buy into that, otherwise you can't reconcile it with yourself.
Yes, there's a creation of us versus them. It's internalized. You become correct, you become human, and the other side becomes other, alien, monstrous feminine, whore, demon, zombie. Any kind of language you want to assign to it that has some kind of abject component to it is completely legitimate in terms of describing what's going on.
Like, imagine everything we've seen in Gaza since October 23. Imagine if you saw similar images coming out of Belfast in 1995. Could you even fathom that happening? Could you even imagine a context where that would be acceptable because of the racial dynamics there? You couldn't imagine that happening. You just couldn't. So why is it okay when it's the Middle East? Because we've dehumanized them to such an extent. And I'm not defending really conservative religious groups. I hate conservatism. I hate religious fundamentalism and fanaticism.
Yes, but it's also a byproduct. It's criminogenic. It's comorbid. It's the result of settler colonial bodies, projects at work.
But I realise the reason certain countries don't have that is, of course, cultural, but I feel like economics and freedom play a massive role in that.
But freedom is something advertised by the United States, Pax Americana and Pax Britannica. The idea that freedom is the ability for, under neoliberalism, for capitalism to do what it does, which requires a scapegoat. So the more profit, the more infinite growth, the more barbarians you need.
And if you grow up in a really authoritarian government, which is really religious, and there are massive laws against that, there's nothing you can do. Like, how is someone...
Yeah, like, be that in the United States or the state of Israel, or even in the victims of those groups, if somebody grows up in a place that is suffering the effects of settler colonialism, yeah, they're going to be hateful. They're going to be hateful as the colonized, attacking, like Arabs in the Middle East don't like Jewish people, and with good reason. And, so you have to understand why they hate what they hate. They don't hate this other group because for profit reasons. They hate this other group because that group is colonizing them and has been for a long time. Whereas hate coming from the United States is anisotropic. It means a different thing in a different direction, which is to say it serves the profit motive. So there is a difference there, but at the end of the day, harm is harm. So what we're trying to do is first do no harm, hurt not harm in BDSM language. The idea is we want to, through geopolitics and the media that we create in any shape or form, regardless if it's a YouTube video or performance art or an oil painting, it doesn't matter. The idea is that we want to minimize harm, which is to say minimize profit, but we can't do that without going against capital. We can't do that without going against genocide, Cartesian thought, settler colonialism, the Enlightenment and its ghosts, specters of Rome, the shadow of Pygmalion, the cycle of kings, any kind of problematic element, the patriarchy and in Cartesian thought, Cartesian dualism, the colonial binary in terms of he, her, black, white, Christian, non-Christian, the Protestant ethic. There's so many different ways to look at it. We want to minimize harm. So it's possible to kind of invert Anita Sarkeesian's adage and be like, look, I can be intensely critical of a particular group, but still see that they're human and that they're subject. They are who they are through accident of birth and through capitalism doing what it does. And they're just literally born on the wrong side of the fence. And in order to fight profit, we have to see them as human in ways where we have to try and work with liberating them so that they are freed from these criminogenic conditions. And not just overseas, but also at home too. We fight criminogenesis wherever it occurs. We fight the process of abjection wherever it occurs. We fight the police state wherever it occurs. So the Kavernacle's right. It's like I don't like religion, organized religion, period. And even if aggressive settler colonialism wasn't a thing, I still think we should move away from organized religion, because I think organized religion is by and large harmful, or we would have to remove the aspects of organized religion that lead to harm, such as dogma. And dogma isn't exclusive to Catholicism or Christianity. It also exists in Muslim practices like Sharia law, for instance. And you could say, oh, well, women like wearing burqas and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, sure. As long as it's not mandatory, and if they can do it if they want to, that's fine. And, if women want to wear any kind of clothing tied to any religion, as long as it's by choice and it's not in a high control group that's like a cult or is a grift of some kind, or it's tied to settler colonialism and capitalism more broadly, that's one thing. But a lot of organized religions are dogmatic, including ones that are on the receiving end of settler colonialism. And sometimes that's a survival mechanism too. They don't do suicide bombings because they want to. It's a struggle against the colonizer. So that's worth noting as well. You can still be against suicide bombing, but still understand why they're doing it. And ultimately, even though I don't want them to have to resort to that, but I understand why they're doing it.
Going to change Saudi Arabia from the bottom to the top. It doesn't work like that. The only reason Saudi Arabia is changing at all It's because one guy is trying to make it change, because it's an authoritarian kingdom that has really strict laws, is one of the most powerful countries in the region, backed by the most powerful country in the world.
Yep.
Nothing's going to change. Like, how do you expect someone in Saudi Arabia to start advocating for like feminism in your Western understanding?
Yeah, it's unrealistic to basically impose those kinds of expectations on a colonized group, because they're just trying to survive, or they're on fire, or they're getting bombs dropped on them. You know, all we can do is try and express solidarity towards universal liberation, where we solidarize intersectionally while understanding that, you know, not everyone is treated as equal in the eyes of the state, and they're going to respond differently. But, you know, it's like, I'm going to push for solidarity and universal liberation any way that I can with these different oppressed groups. Even if those groups might not view me as totally human, they're also coming from a position of extreme destitution and violence. So I'm not going to hold that against them, and I'm going to, you know, try and raise awareness by talking about videos like these, by consuming them, by writing about them in my own book series, by working with sex workers around the world who are, you know, a lot of times survival sex workers, and oftentimes working from positions of relative secrecy. You know, I've worked with sex workers in positions of disadvantage where they have to be very secretive about what they do, but they still want to do activism through sex work. So I'm all about acknowledging the flaws of different colonized groups, but also recognizing my own privilege, and also recognizing that we're not enemies. We have a common enemy, which is the elite and the bourgeoisie. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. The Kavernacle is saying a lot of good stuff. They don't generally say anything that makes me scratch my head, but I'm just going to cut the video off there. The Kavernacle makes a million videos like these, so they're not, strictly speaking, a video essayist. They tend to churn out content much more regularly, and it's not slop. You know, it's guided by a lot of good theory, and they make a lot of really good points, and they come from an oppressed group themselves. You know, they're Irish, you know, and their family is Irish Republicans, you know, and the struggles and the IRA and stuff like that. So they have that history, and they have a really good understanding of that. So you should absolutely check out their channel. It's just, it's much more conversational, but it's good conversation. And, you know, Kavernacle is a very empathetic person. They understand struggle in terms of it needing to be solidarized, and they are a communist, you know, so all kinds of good stuff coming from them. And yeah, I think we're going to wrap up the video. We'll save Hasan for another day. Also, Hasan, you know, he gets enough coverage as it is, but he's also covering Israel breaks the ceasefire, and, you know, he talks about the number of people killed, and there's a lot that I could say about Hasan, but I just don't have time right now, and my voice is getting kind of tired too. So sorry, Hasan, but thank you for talking about, at least, you know, Israel breaks the ceasefire. You know, he's very much getting out in front of that and saying, you know, he's saying it like it is. Yeah, so good job, Hasan. I imagine that you probably have some good stuff to say as well. And then, yeah, Noah Samson, same idea, in terms of where he's talking about stuff. Definitely give his video a watch, and, you know, subscribe to him and the Kavernacle. And even earlier we were talking about Skip Intro, but also Legal Eagle. They're both worth checking out. Legal Eagle, you know, you'll learn a thing or two about American law, and Skip Intro is definitely the person, if you want to learn how to critique media much more effectively than Legal Eagle, definitely check out Skip Intro. Their Copaganda series is really good too. So yeah, that's the video. I'm going to cut it short there. I hope that you, you know, found things likable, and just in terms of, you know, broad strokes, we're talking about liberalism, we're talking about covering Islamophobia from the side of the Western media outlets more broadly, but also just normal people. So, you know, two sides of the same coin in terms of Noah Samson and the Kavernacle. So there's lots to think about there in regards to that. And we talked about Said and Orientalism, and a little bit of history sprinkled in there. It's very conversational, but that's just the kind of style of video that I can offer right now, because I'm still doing a lot of work, and this is something that I can do. I'm doing my part as much as I can because I'm unemployed, and most of the work that I do goes into nonprofit work for helping sex workers, but I like to raise awareness towards political issues like this and preventing genocide as much as I can. But it's just, there's only so much I can do. I'm just one person, and I'm doing a lot of work on my own. So I'm trying to balance some different things right now, but I'm branching out into doing more YouTube stuff as I can. But it's just, you'll have to bear with me. I want to try and talk about this as it's ongoing, be that abroad or at home. So if you like the video, like, share, and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the channel section. If you're bigoted, I'm really trying not to respond to stuff like that too much, unless like there's something worth saying that's educational in nature, where it can be like, okay, this is a Nazi acting like a Nazi, let's use it as an object lesson. But I tend to respond to people who are acting in good faith. So if you have constructive criticism, don't tell me that my production values suck, because I already know that. And this is just me, a trans woman sitting in front of a microphone. I can't really do much better as far as that goes, and all the money that I make through donations and commissions goes towards helping sex workers. So I can't afford new equipment right now. So if somebody wants to donate towards that, I'll leave my donation links in my channel description. So yeah, there's that as well. I'll leave some donor links. And other than that, I like good feedback and stuff like that. And leave whatever you want to leave. And until next time, thanks for watching, and take care.